Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to the third lecture in the Consciousness and Reality Colloquium series, which seeks to inspire interdisciplinary investigations on topics such as the mind, cognition, consciousness, and the nature of reality. I'm Kunal Mule, a research scientist in the Division of Physics, Math, and Astronomy at Caltech. And it is a pleasure to welcome today Liad Mudrik, who has a double PhD. Liad completed her dissertations in 2011 and 2014 at Tel Aviv University. And one of her dissertations is in cognitive neuroscience that focuses on the roles of consciousness and attention. And the other dissertation from 2014 was in philosophy, dealing with the mind-body problem. So she did a very short postdoc at Caltech, working with Christoph Koch and Ralph Adolphs. And in 2015, Liad went back to Tel Aviv as a faculty member to develop a lab for investigating high-level cognition. Her research group is currently addressing questions such as what is consciousness, how does it come about, what are its functions, and how does cognition affect perception? So before we request Liad to present, I would like to note that some selected questions from the Q&A box will be taken up after the presentation. So I encourage all participants to submit their questions through the Q&A button that you will see at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with this, I would like to welcome Liad. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. I want to make sure that you see my presentation now. Is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So I will try to take you through this journey, and I suggest that we can adopt a neuroscientific philosophical approach to study questions of consciousness and free will. And during this talk, I would first highlight the challenge. So why is it so complicated to study these types of questions and how we can do that empirically? I will then focus also in the spirit of this series in the question of what am I even talking about when I'm talking about consciousness? How is it relate to reality? How real is consciousness? Also given some views that think that consciousness is in fact an illusion, or at least the way we speak about it is illusory. And then I will give you two examples of how we in our lab have tried to tackle questions that are of philosophical and neuroscientific importance, trying to tackle them with empirical tools. And this will relate to consciousness and to free will. But let's first start with the challenge itself. So I've always been motivated by the Socratic inscription, know thyself, which is also ascribed to the Oracle of Delphi. And philosophers have been trying to do that for centuries, usually or classically from the armchair. So the philosopher sits there in front of his or her table, and then they try to think and contemplate and derive conceptual arguments about the phenomena of interest. And these are all highly, I think, interesting and thought-provoking. But interestingly enough, in recent decades, we find more and more neuroscientific studies that try to approach questions that for centuries, or at least decades, have been considered to be outside the realm of empirical investigation and have now become and are becoming more and more part of and parcel of everyday neuroscience. So you can think about studies approaching the neural correlates of love or of rationality, or the topics that I'm more interested in of consciousness and of free will. Now, these are, of course, two highly complicated and philosophically charged phenomena, yet still we try to study them empirically and even have the boldness of claiming that we might generate some interesting insights using empirical data, not leaving this question only to philosophers. But I want to highlight that there is a great challenge, and we should do that with humility. So when we start examining this highly complicated phenomena in the lab, we should take into account three aspects of this challenge that in a way pertain to every empirical investigation, but I would claim that it is even more complicated when we are interested in these types of phenomena. So I will highlight in this talk the difficulties that are involved in defining the theoretical construct. So we're talking about consciousness, this highly loaded concept. How do we translate that into a psychological state that we can then study in the lab and also look into the neural correlates of that state? Once we have our definition and our translation from the philosophical domain to the psychological one, we can then ask how to correctly operationalize this theoretical construct into an experiment, something we can measure, something we can manipulate, the basics of any experiment. And this is, again, something that we do for every research question, but I would claim, and I would try to show you, that it might be a bit more complicated when it comes to topics like consciousness and free will. And finally, we also want to interpret the results and go back from the empirical findings into sometimes philosophical theories. And this should be done with caution. So for example, in a previous work with Uri Maoz, who was also like me a postdoc at Caltech. So I'm very excited to be here and thankful for this invitation, because it kind of brings me back to these wonderful days there, or here, I should say. And here we try to also highlight the difficulties that sometimes emerge when neuroscientists approach these highly complicated phenomena, and sometimes even, I would say, commit fallacies. That in this case, for example, we highlighted instances where scientists that I believe are proclaimed materialist or physicalist, but they still speak or write as if they were dualists, because some of the dualistic remnants of everyday thinking kind of find their way into scientific writing. So this is just to kind of give you an example of the type of problems that we might have. But now let's get to the real stuff. So I'm going to start with the question of what is consciousness. And when we ask that question, we're already in the domain of defining the theoretical construct. Now, as you know, consciousness has been interpreted in many, many ways in philosophical writings, ranging between the qualitative aspect of a stimulus, the what it is like. I imagine that this group, who has already heard several talks, is familiar with Thomas Nagel's famous paper from the 70s, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. This idea that when we speak about consciousness, what we really care about is the subjective nature of experience, the subjective aspect of experience. How it feels like, in my case, my favorite example is eating chocolate. So we know the qualitative aspect of chocolate, or of seeing a red rose, or the blue sky, or what have you. But you can also think about other definitions. So some would be interested in the mere access that we have to that piece of information and our ability to manipulate it. And the philosopher Ned Block has famously differentiated between these two aspects of consciousness, the phenomenological aspect versus the access aspect of it. You could also think about much higher level concepts like self-awareness and even political awareness and consciousness at large, which is related also to cognition. So I want to be very clear about the phenomenon that I'm interested in and that I'm defining as consciousness for our investigation, which is indeed the ability to have experiences that are qualitative, but also accessed by me. So I am able to report them. I'm talking merely about sensory consciousness, or experiences. So it does not pertain at this stage to emotions, for example. It's the way I experience the world. I should say that sometimes my experiences could also be inner. So I could have an experience of a thought, but still the idea is that it's always intentional not in the sense of intention, but going back to the philosopher Brentano, the idea of consciousness being about something. It has a subject. So I am experiencing it, and it has a content that I'm experiencing, and in that respect, this is the type of consciousness, perceptual awareness, that we as a field have been focused on. Now, you could also ask then, how do we operationally define it? And as I will show you in a few minutes, the operational definition actually makes a huge difference on the results that we get and the conclusions that we draw, which is something that I think we should always take into account. We could also ask, how to interpret the results. So even before the results, we could also ask if it's real or not. And I want to allude to that because I understand that that's also a key theme of this series of lectures. So as I've said at the beginning, there are some theories and some philosophical approaches that would hold that what I call consciousness is an illusion in some sense. So one of the most recent theories suggesting that is the attentional schema theory from Michael Graziano at Princeton, claiming that all we have is attention and we need to have a schema or a model of our attention in order to control it. And this model of attention is what we, in a way, mistakenly call consciousness. And there is no hard problem that we need to solve, and there is no mystery that we need to explain, because in a sense, what we have is only attention and our ability to manipulate it, or a model of attention, which is a caricature of attention, and we just refer to that as consciousness. But this is just one out of many claims according to which there is something erroneous in the way we conceptualize and think about consciousness. Going from Daniel Dennett to Paul Churchland, just to give a few names of philosophers who try to, in a way, invalidate our primary experience of consciousness. And this is a matter of philosophical belief, I think, more than anything else. I'm not sure this is something that science has much to do with. I belong to the camp of people who think, who are realist about consciousness. So as far as I'm concerned, consciousness definitely exists. And I would even go further and say that it's the thing that exists that I'm most certain of, because in here I'm relying on another philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who differentiated between this world of phenomena and the world on its own. So we only have access to our own consciousness. In a way, when I speak to you now and you hear my voice, what you hear is always a construct of your nervous system and the physical stimulus in the world. And we have a bunch of beautiful illusions demonstrating how this is indeed the case. So what I would like to claim here is that A, consciousness exists and it's real, and this is what we experience. B, it's not always veridical, so it does not always accurately represent the world. And that real world is something that we don't have access to. We have pretty good approximations that in most cases, what we experience and the world as it is are very similar, identical, because many people would have, not identical, but similar, because many people would have similar experiences, or we can measure it using physical instruments. But at the end of the day, what I have, what I wake up with, and what I go to sleep with is my conscious experience. And in a way, this is, some would even say, I don't want to say it's the only thing that exists, but it's the only thing that I have certainty for. And everything else, in a way, for me, is an approximation. Now, this is already a philosophical claim. I don't want to go into that here. I just wanted to throw it at you. And then one could ask, what is reality? In what way do I have access to this reality? And what is my role in constructing reality? And there are many theories, I'm sure you are familiar with some of them, of predictive coding and this idea of Bayesian cognition or Bayesian perception, that what we actually experience, what we perceive, is a combination between our prior, our beliefs, our predictions, and the evidence that we gather. And this posterior, which is a combination between this prior and the evidence, is the end result of our reality, in a way. So I'm happy to allude to that later on, but let me now focus on two studies that we have conducted that might highlight to some extent the relations between philosophy and neuroscience, and the way I think a collaboration might be helpful for us, and also some of the difficulties that are encountered. So I'll start with one of the biggest problems in philosophy, the brain-mind relations, or the mind-body problem. And in a way, this has been formulated in 95 as the hard problem of consciousness by David Chalmers, very famously. And he's asking, why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience, the quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle C? How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why or how it so arises. So this is the challenge thrown at us by Chalmers and others. Chalmers claiming that we actually won't be able to pass this barrier, so we will never be able to explain why certain brain areas give rise to consciousness and others do not. But we are still trying to do so. Here I'm going to focus on 4 theories of consciousness. I'll say from the start that these are not the only theories from it, and there are also not the theories that are most correct. These are just the 4 theories that so far have been mostly studied and discussed, and this is why I'm focusing on these 4. So one of them is a global neuronal workspace. I will present each one of them in a sentence or 2, which of course doesn't do them justice, but I hope that it will help you get the gist of these ideas. So GNW, or the Global Neuronal Workspace, suggested by Stanislas Dehaene and Lionel Nakache at the time. Recent versions also include the one by Claire Sargent. And what they claim basically is that unconscious processes are encapsulated and occur within sensory areas, as you can see on the left. But once the information crosses a threshold and it is being amplified by attention, it enters into the specialized network of neurons that are primarily located in frontoparietal areas with long-range connections that can then globally broadcast the information throughout the brain, and that's when the information is conscious. So the difference between conscious and unconscious processing amounts to the information entering this global workspace and being globally broadcasted. IIT, or Integrated Information Theory, developed by Giulio Tononi and Melanie Boly, Christoph Koch, that I believe gave a talk here in this series recently. It's a very interesting theory. It's also interesting because it's highly debated. So the proponents of this theory think that this is the only theory, and others are not even theories, they are explanations. And the critics of this theory think that it's not scientific and cannot be scientifically tested. So it's the field is pretty fractionated with respect to that theory. Interestingly, it doesn't start with the data, but with phenomenology. So Tononi asks, what are the 5 axioms that should characterize any experience? And then he goes a step forward and says, from these axioms, I now derive postulates that define how should a system be built in order to be able to implement that axiom. And then we can go into the brain and ask which structures of the brain fulfill these postulates. Or we can look at a system and ask, to what extent does it fulfill these postulates? And if it does, we will conclude that it is conscious. And this has been famously quantified in a measure called phi. And the idea is that the greater the phi, the more integrated information the system has, the more conscious it is. Higher order thought theory also interestingly started as a philosophical theory put forth by David Rosenthal, and then translated into neuroscience by Hak-Wan Lau. There are also other versions of this theory suggested by Axel Clearmans, Joseph Ledoux, and others. And the idea there is pretty simple. In order for me to be conscious of a certain piece of information, that is represented in the brain, let's say in sensory areas, there should be a higher order state that kind of points at this first order representation or indexes it and says, this is what I am conscious of now. And only by having this higher order state am I conscious of that piece of information. And the proponents of this theory suggest that this higher order state should be represented in frontal areas, specifically those who are involved in metacognition, especially for the Hak-Wan Lau version of this theory. Finally, the recurrent processing theory is one that's suggested by Victor Lame, This theory focuses on first order representation. So in a way, it's the mirror image of the higher order thought branch of theories. And there, the idea is that you don't need any higher order state. The activation within sensory areas in the brain, excuse me, is enough in order for me to be conscious of that information, as long as the processing is conducted in a feedback manner. So if I only process the information in a feed-forward manner, then this would be unconscious. But as long as there is local recurrency, and know that the feedback is not from frontal areas, but within the sensory areas, then the information would be conscious. Now, it's interesting because if you read reviews from the different theories and try to understand what are the neural correlates of consciousness, a term coined again by Christoph Koch and Francis Crick at the late 90s, the beginning of the 2000s, you get very different pictures. So if you're a student trying to understand how does the brain give rise to consciousness, the answer you will get really depends on the review paper that you write. And in a work that was led by Itai Yaron, a PhD student in my lab, in collaboration with Michael Pitts and Lucia Meloni, we kind of started from observing that each theory seems to support itself. So you have many studies that support each one of these theories, but they do not converge onto one agreed upon account. The field is highly fractionated with hardly any crosstalk between the theories. And at the same time, we also observed that there is a high heterogeneity of methods. So we asked, could this latter point explain everything else that we are seeing? And this again pertains to the operational definition. So can it be that our operational definition of consciousness actually determines which theory is about to be supported? So in order to look into that, what we have done or what Itai has done, to be very accurate, is to collect studies that relate to these four theories, either by citing key papers by the theories or just referring to them. And he got, at the end of the day, to 365 papers reporting the results of 412 experiments. And the first thing we asked was, how do these papers divide according to the theories? All neuroscientific papers, so no behavioral studies, all refer to their results in light of at least one of these theories. So the first thing that we noticed was that the papers do not equally divide between the theories. You can see that GNW has been most widely studied, followed by recurrent processing, then IIT, and finally higher order thought, a theory that has been widely discussed in philosophy, but less so with respect to empirical studies. Another quite striking observation is the relations between papers that supported the theory in blue and papers that challenged the theory in red. And this confirmatory bias, so the idea that we tend to confirm theories rather than challenge them, is not something that is unique to studies of consciousness. And I kind of urge you all to think about your own fields and think about how many challenging papers you've read as opposed to supporting ones. If we take into account philosophy of science, Karl Popper and others, then we surely know that science makes progress by means of challenging ideas and not only confirming ideas. We wanted to ask if this is something that is maybe can be explained by the fact that the field of the neuroscientific study of consciousness is relatively young. So we just looked at these effects over time, and we asked, maybe with time, we'll get more and more challenging papers and less papers that support the theory. Maybe we could see that one theory succeeds and the others kind of fade, so to speak. But when we look at the effects over time, we don't find those trends. So if you look at the middle figure, for example, you see that the number of papers supporting the theory just keep accumulating. So this is a cumulative figure with the year on the x-axis and the number of experiments supporting the theory on the y-axis. And as you can see, all these theories just keep getting more and more support. So then this seems like evidence for a limited crosstalk between the theories, because it's not as if the success of one theory leads to the failure of another theory. So then the next question Itai asked was, why is that the case? And so he examined the proportion of papers that set out to begin with to test specific predictions by the theory, as opposed to just interpreting the results post hoc in light of one theory or another. And what he found was that only about a third of the papers were theory driven. So writing in their introduction any prediction of a theory that they are setting to test. Interestingly enough, when you look at papers that challenge the theories, again, way less than those that supported it, you find a much higher rate of papers that are actually theory driven. So we think that that implies that we need more a priori tests of theories rather than papers that just find something. Let's say I find frontal activations and I say, oh, this is in line with theory XYZ, in this case, global neural workspace and higher order thought. But I think the most critical point, or two very critical points in Itai's work, are the following. First, we wanted to ask, when we aggregate all the findings together of this huge amount of studies, what brain areas differentiate between conscious and unconscious processing, or what brain areas are candidates of being the neural correlates of consciousness? And when we do that, we see that almost the entire brain lights up as the neural correlates of consciousness, besides the cerebellum, which is a good thing. But still, none of the theories predicts this widespread activation with so many areas being marked as correlates of consciousness. But perhaps more alarming is that when you divide the papers or the experiments based on the theory they ended up supporting, what you get is 4 very different worldviews. So papers that supported GNW tended to report more frontal activations, while papers that supported recurrent processing found visual areas that differentiate between conscious and unconscious processing. So where does the truth lie? Or if we go back to the theme of reality, what is the real neural correlates of consciousness? I don't have a good answer, and the literature doesn't have a good answer. And the final question that Itai asked is, can it be that the operational definition, the way the researchers have set up their experiments, can it be that that on its own already biases the interpretation of the results, or at least I would say influences the possible outcomes? So in order to test for that, you can see on the left the division to different methods. You can see the high heterogeneity of methods in the field. What Itai did was to take a random forest classifier and feed this classifier with all the theoretic or all the methodological choices of the researchers. So for example, what was the sample? What were the measures of consciousness? What neuroscientific technique was used, and so on? Did the subjects report or not? And so on and so forth. The classifier had nothing to do with the results themselves. So the classifier was not given any data points, excuse me, about what the actual results were. And the question was, can we predict above chance? And when I say chance here, we already take into account the unequal division of papers into theories, which on its own could be used by the classifier. So we want to see whether we can go beyond that. Can we predict above chance what the outcome would be? And the answer is yes. Quite resoundingly, I would even say. So when you look at the performance, we can predict at 80% accuracy which theory is about to be supported just based on the methodological choices. And we also highlight the critical aspects that determine the performance of the classifier. I would also say, I just want to share with you that Itai went a step forward and also constructed this database, which is open for everyone to use. And what you can do in this database basically is to conduct your own queries. So ask it, for example, to give you all the studies that use fMRI to study faces and get how they divide according to different paradigms they used. You can save the information to a CSV and get all these papers so you can then work with them. You can conduct queries about how different papers, different aspects or parameters divide to the different theories. You can look at effects of methodology, focusing on a specific methodology and see how it divides to different theories and so on and so forth. You could also look at effects over time. So to ask, excuse me, how many studies or experiments used a specific parameter and how that changed over time. And you can even, if you scroll below, you can even look at the world map of consciousness. So you could look at different countries and see which theory has been supported in which one of these countries. So to get a more sociological view on the field. So I welcome you all to look at this database and enjoy playing with it. And I'm hoping that it will be of value to those of you who are interested in consciousness. So going back to these challenges that I highlighted, you can see that the operational definition has a major role in determining our conclusions. And one of the important insights of this work is that we really need to have more studies that are designed a priori in order to test theories of consciousness if we want to make progress. And luckily enough, this is exactly the idea behind a recent initiative by David Podgirter from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, which launched a series of adversarial collaboration between proponents of different theories of consciousness, working together in order to try and devise a conclusive test that would allow us to make progress in trying to arbitrate between theories. And the project that I'm involved in started by an invitation from David Podgirter and Christoph Koch to attend this meeting at the Allen Institute in Seattle. This was already almost 5 years ago. And it was literally 2 extremely exciting and invigorating days where proponents of the theories, together with some unaffiliated scientists like myself and others, and philosophers have been discussing key predictions. And for example, using just a whiteboard, drawing different predictions of the different theories. At the time, we had 3 theories, but at the end of the day, we ended up deciding on 2 experiments that would test 2 theories: global neuronal workspace and IIT. And I'll tell you a little bit about this work, which has been going on. Already a spoiler, there is no, I will not give you the final answer. I'm just telling you about the process at this point. But we have 2 experiments, one that is focused exclusively on presenting highly visible stimuli for different durations, some of them task relevant, some of them task irrelevant, following work that has already been done by others, and trying to ask, how do we maintain a percept over time? And how can we make sure that or I would say, which brain structures support or represent information, have information about the content of our experience, even with when this experience is highly task irrelevant. So this is the point of the first experiment. The second experiment is a video game that we developed, which on its own was an interesting endeavor, where the video game, I can show you, it goes like that. Basically, you have this player, which is the blue essence at the bottom of this very loud. And sorry. And you're basically trying to collect these falling essences. But as you might see, in the background, we sometimes present a face, like was presented just now. And then we pause the game every now and then and ask you if you saw the stimulus. And what happens is that people are so engaged in the video game that they often miss the stimuli that we present, although they are presented at full contrast. And this inattentional blindness paradigm allows us then to contrast between seen and unseen stimuli. And so this allowed us to derive very specific predictions, both from GNW and from IIT, that were pre-registered and are now free for everyone to look at and conduct their own experiments. And this was published already. And the foundation even had Julio and Stan, the adversaries, sign letters telling us that they agree with the experiments, they agree with their predictions, they agree that the experiments test the predictions. So that at the end of the day, when we have more results and more answers, I imagine that what would happen anyways, that they would say, well, in retrospect, this experiment might not have been good and that experiment might not have been good. Or they will just say, we were wrong about some aspects of our theory. But in any case, the entire process is transparent. So we can now know what happened in hindsight, so which insights were gained later on in the process and what was already conceived at the beginning. So what about the results? I'll just give you a small peek at the results because we are now working on them. We are hoping to present them at the upcoming ASSC conference, so the Association of the Scientific Study of Consciousness in New York. But last year, we already presented some results of our decoding analysis. And what we have shown there, the prediction that we set out to test, which is one of many, I should say, so only a small piece of the puzzle, was where in the brain can we find information about stimuli that are clearly visible, consciously experienced, although not task relevant or not always task relevant. And we found, in line with IIT's predictions, information about the category of the stimuli in posterior areas. I should say that that is also compatible with GNW. We also found information in frontal areas in line with the global neuronal workspace. And this is work by Aya Khalaf from the fMRI team. However, when we look at MEG and ECOG data, we see that the information in frontal areas, and this is work by Ling Liu and Simon Henin, we see that the information actually is found earlier than the time that was predicted by the global neuronal workspace. And similarly, when we look at the coding of orientation, so we have stimuli on the screen, they're always visible and they have different orientation. And when we look, so we are, if we perceive them, this information, then we are supposed to be able to decode them from the brain as well. And here we were only able to decode from posterior areas and not frontal ones. So in principle, this goes against the prediction of the global neuronal workspace. Now, of course, this could also always be a matter of signal to noise ratio. And what's more important for me to say is that this is only one small piece of the puzzle. So one prediction from the two theories out of 4 analyses that we are doing. So at the end of the day, the picture that we will portray is much, much richer. And I can already tell you that at the end of the day, I think what we are going to have in this project is not like a full agreement with either IIT or GNW. Both theories are going to be right on some things and going to be wrong on other things. And we hope that progress will be made by understanding which aspects of which theory are correct and which ones are not. I just want to highlight that this is a huge amount of work. We have fMRI, MEG, ECOG, 11 different labs around the world, a very dedicated postdocs and students who are doing the hard work. And I feel very fortunate to be a part of this work. Now, just to conclude, the last part of this talk will focus around free will. Now, if you thought that consciousness is complicated, I would say that free will is probably way more complicated. I realized that when I started working in that field, because and I'm relatively new, I should say, so I've been studying consciousness for, I guess, a bit less than 20, somewhere between 15 to 20 years now. Free will is just a matter of, I don't know, 7. And what I realized is that for consciousness, you don't have a good enough definition yet, but at least everyone is talking about more or less the same thing. For free will, when you read the literature, you realize that there are actually very different definitions of the concept on its own, which I think by itself is interesting. I'm going to focus on the definition of consciousness, which is how most studies in neuroscience have approached the problem. And this is, again, just to highlight the critical choice of defining the theoretical construct. So what are we talking about when we talk about free will? And famously, experiments by Benjamin Libet have shown, and others later on, this has been widely replicated. So what Libet has done in the 80s was to have subjects sit in front of this clock with a rotating dot. He had them connected to an EEG to record their brain activity and EMG to record their muscle activity. And he asked them to flex their hand or flex their wrist or move their finger when they felt the conscious urge to move, and then report to where the dot was on that screen when they felt that urge. And the idea would be to look at the chronological aspects of the movement onset, the conscious will to move, and the neural activity that is related to movement. And the critical finding, which of course became highly cited and discussed, was that if you move at 0, so you start flexing, you start contracting your muscles at 0, then about 200 milliseconds earlier, you report the conscious urge to move, which is great because first we want to move and then we move. But famously, about 500 milliseconds prior to movement onset, and some even find it earlier, we already see this gradual increase of neural activity or the readiness potential, as it is called, recorded in the EEG. And you can see it here in the plot. And so the idea was that if we can already find neural activation that is related to the decision before subjects even knew that they have the conscious urge to move, then consciousness does not play a causal role in the decision-making of voluntary action. And thus we are not free. And indeed, there have been many, many books written on that, saying that we are not free. And if you go back to Hamlet deliberating, whether he wants to be or not to be, then maybe there is no point in this deliberation, because at the end of the day, this is an unconscious process and our conscious deliberation doesn't play a role in it. So we, together with Uri Maoz, who was then a postdoc in Christoph's lab, and Gideon Yaffe, now a philosopher at Yale, we kind of pondered upon these studies. And one thing that we realized is that all these studies that showed this increase in activation prior to movement onset, which precedes the conscious urge to move, they have all, by and large, been focused on what we call picking decisions. And when I say we, it's not we invented, it's actually a term taken from a philosophical paper by Ulan Margalit and Morgenbesser in the 70s. And Ulan Margalit and Morgenbesser differentiated between picking decisions. Imagine you're going to the supermarket and you're just randomly picking one milk bottle out of a row of identical ones, as opposed to going to the supermarket and deliberating, do you want this brand or the other brand? Do you want the skim milk or the whole milk, and so on and so forth, the expensive or the cheap? So in choosing, you have reasons that you have to weigh in order to reach your decision. In picking, there are no reasons that could help you resolve the conflict. At the end of the day, you're just randomly acting, and typically there are also no consequences for picking, while there are consciousness for choosing. So what we realized that in all these experiments, subjects have not been making the decision if they want to be or not to be, but instead they were making the decision if they want to move or not to move. And we think that this is not the question when it comes to free will, because free will and like the Libet findings have been extrapolated to make claims about moral responsibility, for example. And moral responsibility is never about choosing, about picking, sorry. It's always about choosing. So we wanted to ask whether these findings by Libet, will they also generalize to meaningful deliberate decisions? And what we have done was to create an experiment whereby we recruited participants who attested to be socially involved. And we first gave them a list of nonprofit organizations, and we asked them to rate the degree by which they are willing to contribute, to donate money, to donate money to one of these organizations. And as you can see, there are ones that are fairly consensual, but there are also ones that are highly debated. So if you are pro-life, then you wouldn't donate to Planned Parenthood and so on and so forth, because we wanted to get a range of tendencies to donate. And then what we have done was to tailor-make an experiment per participant, where in each trial, they were presented with two causes representing two nonprofit organizations. And we asked them in the deliberate block or in the choosing condition to choose to which organization they want to donate money. And they knew that at the end of the day, we will have a lottery. At the end of the experiment, we will have a lottery. And the trial that would be selected, we will actually make a $40 donation in their name to that organization. And they knew more than that at the end of the entire session and experiment, we will have a big lottery that in which one subject will be selected or one participant will be selected. And if it is you by chance, then we will actually make a donation, an additional donation on top of the $40 that is of $1,000 in your name. So they knew, to the organization that you chose. So they knew that each decision that they make in each trial could translate into a $1,000 donation. In the picking condition or the arbitrary one, we had the same organization names appearing on screen, but whatever you choose or whatever you pick, both organizations will get $500. So we have the same visual input, the same motor output, because you're always pressing right or left. But in one condition, you're making a meaningful decision and that has consequences, and you have to decide to which organization you want to donate money. And in the other condition, you're making a random, arbitrary decision between the two options. And so behavior did show us that participants were following the instructions. What did we find in the brain? So I'm showing you individual subjects because I think this is way more informative. So you can see that in the arbitrary condition, whether the decision was easy or hard, and that pertains to the difference between the two options that we presented, you get a readiness potential, not for all participants, but for most of them you get it. And it's very clear, a very clear replication of the Liad finding. What about the deliberate condition? There, we just don't find the readiness potential. Also, when we look at the average activity, we don't find it. We had a computational model that tried to explain that. So if Liad had defined his voluntary action or his study of free will focusing on deliberate rather than arbitrary decisions, then all these theories, philosophical and others, about the lack of free will might have not been found. Just to say, what do we think about these results is not that we think that we have provided any positive evidence for the existence of free will, or not that I think that deliberate decisions are not originated in the brain. I think they do. The only thing that we have shown here is that the main neuroscientific evidence against free will, defined as consciousness being involved in decision-making, does not generalize to deliberate decisions and can only be found for arbitrary ones. So I hope that I've persuaded you that it's interesting and it's worthwhile to explore somewhat philosophical questions with empirical tools. I also hope that I persuaded you that it's not an easy task. And here I would very much like to call and kind of emphasize the importance of interdisciplinary dialogue between philosophers and neuroscientists with these types of complicated questions. I think it's very, very important. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that for me, at least, it has highly, highly enriched my work and helped me clarify some of the key concepts that we were working with. So I want at this point to thank you and also thank my lab in Israel, whom I miss very much. I'm now doing a sabbatical here at Caltech and at Chapman University. And also, of course, the funding agency that allowed me to conduct this work. And now I'll be very happy to get your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent talk, Liad. So while the questions are trickling in, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you, bring you back to maybe that reality aspect, because there are two aspects, as far as I can see, to this colloquium series, which are important. One is consciousness, and the other one is reality, which is sort of what I define as external reality. So looking at it from the perspective of embryogenesis, for example, right? I mean, brain is not even the first organ to form in the body, to be honest. But nature somehow knows how to create brains, right? And how to bring consciousness to being, if we believe in these brain theories of consciousness. So what do you think is the interplay between that external reality and whatever intelligence might be driving that external reality versus individual consciousness? This brings us to an interesting philosophical question again, is why is nature behaving in the way it does in order to create these individual conscious beings, right?
Okay, those are huge questions. Why does nature behave the way it does? I don't know. It's not within my field of expertise, but if I would have to you forced me to speculate, I think my answer would be nature behaves the way it does, probably due to, wonderful coincidence that got nature to be at the point where it is. So a list of, this is evolution theory, right? So a list of marvelous mutations that created and affected by and selected by the need to survive, got us to the point of history where we are, with the nature behaving the way it does. That's my view. Other people, of course, could have other views. But with respect to the external reality and individual consciousness, what I would say is that individual consciousness is our way to get to the best model we can of the external world. And I think there is a fundamental and highly complicated question here that we sometimes often neglect, which is the brain itself doesn't have any information about the external world per se. So, the brain gets readiness potential and information from the eye. So the cells in your eye, they are able to transduct, to translate information about wavelength into changes in voltage, basically, which then trickle a series of neurochemical events that then translate into other neurons changing their potential, and so on and so forth. So when I see a rose, nothing in the brain itself has information to the rose on its own. It only has information to the resulting neural activity that has been generated by the eye. So then when for example, if I'm a researcher, you probably heard about the Jennifer Aniston neurons, right? So there are these neurons in the brain. Their more formal name is concept cells. They were, again, so today is like a tribute to Christoph. So they were discovered by Christoph Koch and by Yitzhak Fried, a very renowned neurosurgeon from Israel, actually, working at UCLA. And what they discovered with Quiroga and others is that you have these cells in the medial temporal lobe which always respond to, in that case, Jennifer Aniston, picture, name, what have you. And then we will call them Jennifer Aniston neurons because we as external observers know that they fire whenever we presented a picture of Jennifer Aniston. But how does the brain know to code, to decipher this code, and to do this very complicated decoding is actually a very deep question that I think most existing theories, don't provide a good answer to.
Right, thank you very much. So we'll go on to the questions asked by our participants, and we will take the first question by Akhanditi Das, who asks, wonderful presentation. He says, wonderful presentation and congratulations on your approach. It seems that we have a set of theories, each looking at specific experiential activities related to conscious experience. It seems that the aspects of the whole brain are involved, but none of these seem to address the actual qualitative nature of the experience. Where is the theory that can predict qualitative experience, and what would be the operational definition you would address in the experiment?
Thank you for this question. So I think that the theories greatly vary with respect to the phenomenal aspect of consciousness. So for GLW, for example, they would tell you, we are primarily focused in access. So in being able to know that this is what I'm experiencing. And so the content of experience, the phenomenal aspect of it, is determined by the representations in sensory areas. When these are broadcasted, then this is the type of content that we experience. But why does this specific neural activity translate into a specific qualitative aspect? I don't think that the theory currently answered that question. IIT actually has the ambition to explain qualitative aspect, the qualitative aspect of consciousness. So for them, and this is now, I don't know if Christoph got into that when he gave the talk. I'm going to say now a sequence of words that are, hard to understand without going into the actual principles of the theory. But the idea there is that every brain state of a specific system that is built in a specific way can be unfolded into the cause-effect structure, which kind of, in a very oversimplified manner, represents all the limitations that the current state has on past states of the system and on future states of the system. And the distinctions within this unfolded cause-effect structure actually are held to correspond to the phenomenal aspect of the experience. So IIT claims that they are already trying to do that with respect to space. So to map the qualitative experience of space into this unfolded structure. And I know that they are now working on trying to do that for other qualitative aspects as well.
Interesting. Thank you. My interest in consciousness studies began with the perception of space and time. So I'm very much fascinated by your answer, and especially trying to address how do we really tackle this question of how do we really perceive space and time in the first place? Is external space and time somehow related with our experience of space and time itself in terms of a mental phenomenon or something else? It's kind of a fascinating question for me.
So one of my PhD supervisors, Leon Dowell, actually claimed that space and time are prerequisites of any conscious experience. So you cannot have any conscious experience that is not specified in space and time. And that's actually what makes it conscious in a way. So I think that your intuition and your fascination by space and time are very justified with respect to consciousness.
Because one side of me works on gravitational waves and another side works on mind and consciousness. It's a good combination. But anyways, we'll take an interesting question by Alan Weinstein, who is a professor of physics and also working on gravitational waves. So he asks, many people, for example, religious people, believe that consciousness is related to an enduring soul, or let's say some people call it like a conscious force of some sort, conscious self, and in brackets, including past and future lives. Are there any kind of scientific investigations addressing this? And I do know people quote the works of like Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who have looked at like past life memories. But I think the question that Alan is trying to ask is, are there any scientific investigations from the consciousness perspective addressing these kinds of notions, right?
So I'm less familiar with these types of studies. I think that maybe, and this is again a kind of a sociological speculation on my part, that the field has been so focused on demonstrating its legitimacy as a legitimate field of science that it probably kind of intentionally tried to drift away from this type of studies, just because we want to be like mainstream science and we don't want to go into these more maybe spiritual realms, which but again, it's only a speculation. I would say that within consciousness, within the field of consciousness, the prevailing assumption is a physicalistic one, that consciousness is a physical phenomena and that could be explained. I personally think that it's completely driven by the brain, but I also want to say something that a claim that I tried to present in my PhD in philosophy actually was that this stand with respect to this ontological stand about whether consciousness or soul is material or immaterial is not something that would ever be determined by an experiment. Because even if I show you an experiment when people have done that, so you can stimulate the brain and that induces a conscious experience, or that induces a state of mind. So different types of psychological states. If you're a dualist, and specifically if you're a parallelist, you would say, well, there is a perfect harmony between the causal chain of events in the physical world and the causal chain of events in the immaterial world, in the mental world. And this is why you see these correspondences. So if this is your point of view, I don't think there is any experiment that could refute that. And so at the end of the day, I think that one's ontological stand is more a matter of belief, of choice, rather than a matter of being scientifically or determined in a data-driven kind of approach.
Thank you. We will take one or two questions at most because we're running out of time, but I would like to bring in this aspect of free will, because that's a very interesting concept which you touched on. And my question has always been, how do we really study free will? Because if free will is right, we are somehow violating the laws of physics, right? Which Sean Carroll in his last sort of presentation in this series explained very well. But I'll tie this in with the question by Sofia Gallego, who asked that decisions are based on previous data or life experiences, therefore, seems to be never completely independent. And is free will in such a scenario defined as a free decision with respect to new stimuli, or how would we really go about explaining free will or defining free will in this case?
So I said in the talk that I've encountered at least 6 different definitions of free will, and interestingly, also mutually exclusive. So having nothing to do with one another or completely independent. I think that would be more accurate. So one very common intuition and theory, so it's a common intuition that people have and backed up with a lot of philosophical discussion, is, as you said, that in order for a decision to be free, it has to be indeterminate. So this idea of incompatibilism between free will and determinism. And this is my own view, completely disagree with this point of view. So I think that the question of indeterminism, and this is something that took me time also to understand from my own, and I appreciate that this is something that many people would disagree with. I think that people expect 3 things from free will, typically: being indeterminate or undetermined, being compatible with, so being controlled by me, so compatible with my values, views, wills, and so on, and being conscious. So these are the things people would typically ask for to regard a decision as free. But I would claim that the first and second criteria cannot really coexist. And that, I think, relates to also what Sophia said. Because if I am acting based on my values, then I am actually very determined. And to be honest, I want to be predictable. So I want, given, if I go now to vote, and in Israel, unfortunately, we have been voting almost every year with not good results, but that's a different conversation. I want to, when I go to vote, and if I have the same conditions, and if I have the same information, I want to make the same decision. I don't think that me deciding on a whim, or if there is some kind of coin that is being flipped and that determines if I'm going to vote A or vote B, I don't see how this is freedom. Being governed by a random generator of something is not free at all, in my opinion. I think that I am free when I act based on who I want to be. And this touches upon the philosophy of Harry Frankfurt. So I would answer and say that a free decision, as far as I'm concerned, has really nothing to do with whether it has been determined or indeterminate. It has more to do with whether this is something that I want to do and I want to decide. And unfortunately, we often act based on, in accordance with things we don't want to do. So sometimes we yell too much at our kids, or we snap at someone, or whatever, or we make decisions, or we decide to eat the chocolate cake although we want to be on a diet. And I think these are better examples for unfree decisions than when I consciously, after deliberation, make a decision to vote for a party, although it has been 100% predicted that that's the party that I'm going to vote for.
Okay, thank you very much, Liad. And we will end here, but there are a couple of announcements, and just like to let everyone know that there will be a discussion session with Liad on Thursday afternoon this week, and especially for grad students and postdocs. So we can all look forward to that. The next colloquium in the Consciousness and Reality series will be in March and delivered by Anil Seth. So stay tuned for further information on that as well. I would finally like to once again thank Liad, all participants here, and everyone who made this event possible. I wish everyone a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, Kunal, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.